May 1st, 1960, above the Ural Mountains near Sverdlovsk, in the thin blue air where maps were supposed to blur, a lone aircraft moved like a needle through cloth. Inside it sat Francis Gary Powers, a former Air Force pilot flying for the CIA, sealed into a pressure suit, watching instruments more than horizon. Below him was the Soviet Union, a nuclear rival built on secrecy, and ahead of him was Norway and home, if he could stay invisible long enough. Then the sky itself seemed to kick. A flash, a concussion, the sudden sense of a machine losing its argument with gravity. In the Cold War, the fate of one captured pilot could turn a secret mission into a public humiliation, and a humiliation into a broken summit, a hardened standoff, and a world pushed toward irreversible confrontation. Powers hit the ground alive. Once he did, who would control what happened next? The fields outside Sverdlovsk were ordinary: mud, fence posts, a few spring trees, and that ordinariness mattered. The Cold War wasn't fought only in conference rooms and missile silos. It was fought in places where people could point and say, plainly, "It happened here." Powers came down under a parachute into a country that had spent 15 years building itself into a fortress of information. He was not supposed to exist. In Washington, Dwight D. Eisenhower, the American president and former wartime commander, had accepted a trade that defined the era. The United States needed to see what the Soviet Union was building, and the Soviet Union would not permit inspections. Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet premier who liked to talk as if bluntness could substitute for weakness, needed proof that the Americans were not only hostile, but intrusive and hypocritical. And the men between them, intelligence officers, air defense commanders, diplomats, wanted the same thing every system wants: room to operate and plausible deniability when the operation goes wrong. What began as a high-altitude flight would, in less than 2 years, end at a bridge in divided Berlin, with 2 prisoners walking toward opposite flags. Along the way, every decision, what to reveal, what to deny, what to trade, would tighten the trap around leaders who could not admit they needed each other. If a single captured man could turn reconnaissance into propaganda, what would it take to turn propaganda back into negotiation? Over the Urals, the U-2 had been built for one task: to see without being seen. The aircraft was long-winged and light, designed to loiter above 70,000 feet, beyond the reach of most interceptors of the mid-1950s. Powers' route that day was an audacious diagonal across the Soviet Union, launched from Pakistan and aiming to exit over Norway, an airborne thread drawn straight through the heart of a rival empire. Soviet radar did see it. Soviet air defenses did not accept the old limits anymore. By 1960, the Soviet S-75 missile system, known in NATO as the SA-2, could reach up into that thin air. The decision to keep flying U-2 missions had always been a gamble against time. The Americans needed photographs of bomber fields and missile sites. The Soviets needed only one success. Accounts differ on the exact choreography of the shootdown: how close the missile detonated, how the aircraft broke, what Powers tried to do in the seconds afterward, but the result was unarguable. The plane came apart. A piece of the Cold War fell into a Soviet pasture. Powers fought the instinct to die with the aircraft. The U-2 carried a self-destruct mechanism, but in a chaotic breakup at altitude, procedures become suggestions. He was thrown against the cockpit, fighting for control that no longer existed, trying to align his body with an ejection that was never designed for a graceful exit. He ended up outside the aircraft, alive, the parachute blooming below a sky that no longer belonged to him. On the ground, local people ran toward the landing. They were not abstract enemies, they were farmers, workers, men in caps, a world that had been told to watch for saboteurs. Within minutes, uniformed security arrived. Powers was searched, his survival already turning into an intelligence windfall. In his pockets were items that spoke in the language of clandestine work, maps, foreign currency, and, most famously, a hollowed silver dollar that concealed a poison pin, a final option he did not use. The first true decision of the new chain was not made in Washington or Moscow. It was made in the grass by a pilot who chose life. In the Cold War, that choice meant that the mission did not end when the aircraft fell. It merely changed mediums. From Sverdlovsk, Powers was moved quickly. The Soviet state did not improvise with surprises. It absorbed them. He was taken through a web of air defense units, local security, and then to Moscow, the city whose broad avenues and sealed buildings had been designed to make individuals feel small. The Lubyanka, headquarters of Soviet security, was more than a building. It was a symbol of what happened when the state wanted the truth, or wanted a confession that would substitute for truth. Powers' interrogators did not need to beat him into usefulness. They needed him intact, coherent, able to speak. The Soviet Union had options. It could shoot him quietly and deny everything. It could hold him indefinitely. Or it could do what Khrushchev's political instincts favored, make him visible and make him speak, and use him to prove a story the Kremlin already believed. Khrushchev had a reason beyond anger. A summit meeting with Eisenhower was scheduled in Paris in mid-May. Khrushchev had sold the possibility of détente, limited, cautious, but real, to a party apparatus trained to see softness as danger. If he arrived in Paris under the shadow of an American spy flight, he needed leverage, better than leverage, humiliation. So the second major decision was restraint. The Soviets did not immediately announce the pilot. They announced only a violation, an American plane downed over the Soviet Union. It was a partial disclosure, a hand held back, waiting to see what Washington would do. In Washington, the early reports were confusion wrapped in confidence. The U-2 program was secret but not fragile. It had survived years of risk and denial. A missing aircraft did not automatically mean a catastrophe. The CIA, under Director Allen Dulles, had rehearsed contingency plans for a lost aircraft. The usual assumption was that the pilot would be dead and the wreckage scattered. That assumption shaped the American response. Within days, the United States issued a cover story. A civilian research aircraft, a weather plane operated under NASA cover, had gone missing, perhaps with a pilot who had blacked out. A photograph was released of a U-2 with NASA markings, an almost theatrical prop designed to anchor the lie in something people could picture. It was a decision made in the old logic of plausible deniability, when technology still offered a thin fog of uncertainty. But the Soviets were holding the one fact that punctured fog. They had the pilot, they had his equipment, they had sections of the aircraft, and now they had Washington's denial. This is the first point where the stakes sentence becomes real, a captured man turning reconnaissance into propaganda. When the United States chose to deny, it gave Khrushchev the chance not only to accuse, but to catch. Several days after the American cover story, Khrushchev spoke again. He did it in stages, like a man savoring a reveal. First, he let the world believe the Americans might be able to wriggle free. Then he announced with a kind of coarse satisfaction that the pilot was alive and had confessed. In that moment, the crisis became irreversible in a particular way. A secret operation can be forgiven. A public lie is a different kind of insult. The summit in Paris was no longer about arms control alone. It was now about whether the American president could be made to kneel. A natural question hovered over every capital. If the Americans lied about this, what else were they lying about? The Cold War fed on that question the way fire feeds on oxygen. Back in Moscow, Powers was prepared for display. He was shown the consequences of his capture, pieces of his aircraft laid out like evidence in a courtroom, his survival recast as Soviet competence. The Soviet state made a claim. It could defend itself, and it could expose American intrusion. Powers wrote letters. He answered questions. He learned quickly that his individual choices, whether to cooperate, whether to resist, would be used regardless. If he refused, he would be portrayed as stubborn and guilty. If he spoke, he would be portrayed as confessing and guilty. There were few exits that did not lead to the same propaganda. Still, he made choices within the narrow lanes available. He admitted he had flown a spy mission. He described what he could, balancing self-preservation against what he understood as duty. Later debates would rage about how much he revealed. In the moment, the reality was simpler. An isolated man trying to survive an apparatus that had time, leverage, and a public stage. While Powers sat in a Moscow cell, Eisenhower faced the same kind of narrowing. The United States could apologize, halt flights, and try to preserve the summit. Or it could refuse, accept the diplomatic wreckage, and preserve the principle that intelligence gathering was necessary in a world where the Soviet Union hid its weapons. Eisenhower had already felt the burden of these flights. He had authorized them because he feared miscalculation more than he feared political embarrassment. The U-2 program was meant to answer a terrifying uncertainty, whether the Soviets had a bomber gap or a missile gap, whether they were preparing an attack, whether American deterrence was an illusion. In that sense, the flights were a kind of insurance policy against panic. But insurance policies look different when a claim is filed in public. Khrushchev arrived in Paris ready to set terms. The location itself mattered. Paris in 1960 was a stage for post-war legitimacy, a place where the leaders of superpowers could stand in the same rooms and pretend the world was manageable. The opening of the summit was formal, polite, almost brittle. Then Khrushchev demanded what he wanted: an apology, punishment for those responsible, and a guarantee that U-2 flights would cease. It was not a private demand. It was designed to be heard. Eisenhower offered what he could without surrendering his authority. He expressed regret that the flight had occurred, announced that such flights would be halted, but refused to grovel and refused to hand Khrushchev a theatrical victory. He would not publicly punish those who had executed orders in a program he had authorized. He would not allow the Soviet leader to dictate American domestic discipline. For Khrushchev, that refusal was the point. The summit collapsed in a storm of words. Khrushchev walked out. The cameras caught the gestures. Diplomacy became theater, and theater became policy. A quiet preview sentence had been hanging in the air since the parachute opened over Sverdlovsk. The wreckage of one aircraft could travel, in fragments and headlines, from a field to a summit and then into the architecture of the Cold War itself. Now it did. The collapse of Paris hardened the line between the two powers, and it did so at the exact moment when the nuclear arsenals were growing and the margin for error was shrinking. This is where the story's balance shifts. The United States had sought information to avoid worst-case assumptions. The Soviet Union had sought security to avoid American intrusion. Now both sides had created a new certainty. Each would interpret the other's actions through suspicion first. By late spring of 1960, the immediate advantage belonged to Khrushchev. He had embarrassed the Americans, derailed a summit, and proved that Soviet defenses could reach where American technology had claimed invulnerability. The United States, meanwhile, had lost both a plane and the moral footing of honesty, and it had a pilot in enemy hands. Powers became a prisoner with a calendar. In August 1960, in Moscow, the Soviets put Francis Gary Powers on trial. The courtroom was arranged like a stage set built to instruct. Journalists were present. The judges were officials of a system that did not treat trials as uncertain contests. Powers was not there to be acquitted. He was there to validate a narrative. The location mattered because it was a kind of seal. Moscow was the center of Soviet authority. To bring an American pilot there, to place him under Soviet law and Soviet cameras, was to announce that the Soviet Union could take an American secret and make it Soviet property. Powers entered in a suit, looking younger than his reputation, thin from confinement. He listened through translation. He answered questions. His confession, prepared under interrogation and aligned with Soviet needs, was presented as proof of American aggression. The sentence was 10 years, with a portion in prison and the remainder in labor. It was severe enough to satisfy Soviet public anger and Soviet ideology, but it was not a death sentence. That absence was itself a decision. Khrushchev and the security services were not merely punishing, they were preserving an asset. Because by 1960, the Soviet Union had something else it wanted back. 4 years earlier, in June 1957, in Brooklyn, New York, a man named Rudolf Abel had been arrested in a cheap hotel room. Rudolf Abel was not his real name. He was, in fact, William Fischer, a Soviet intelligence officer, what the Soviets called an illegal, operating without diplomatic cover, living as an ordinary American, running networks, receiving coded messages, building the quiet infrastructure of espionage. His capture had come through the human weakness every intelligence service fears: betrayal. A Soviet defector had pointed American authorities toward Abel. When the FBI closed in, they found the tools of his trade: hollow coins, coded notes, microdots, small, almost elegant mechanisms designed to make secrets portable. Abel's trial, held in the United States, became a test of American confidence. The government could have pushed for the harshest possible punishment. It did not. Abel was represented by James B. Donovan, a New York attorney and former OSS man who argued that even a spy deserved a lawful defense. Donovan's stance was not sentimental, it was strategic in a deeper sense. A country that wanted to project strength needed to show it did not fear its own rules. Abel was convicted and sentenced to 30 years in federal prison. He was sent to Atlanta, to a concrete world of routines and locked doors. At the time, many Americans wanted him gone, disappeared, executed. Donovan's insistence on due process looked to some like softness, but the Cold War was a long game played with human pieces, and a living spy is always a potential bargaining chip. By the time Powers stood in a Moscow courtroom, the equation had changed. Now the Americans had a man they desperately wanted back. Now the Soviets had a man they desperately wanted back. The prisoners were not equal in fame, but they were comparable in function. Both were proof of the other side's reach. The systems that had captured them could not admit how much they needed them. In the months after the trial, Powers was moved to Vladimir Central Prison, east of Moscow, a gray institution built for endurance. Prison is a geography of narrowed choices: corridors, cells, scheduled walks, light that comes when it is allowed. For Powers, time became both punishment and negotiation. Every day he remained alive increased the possibility that he might be traded. Every day he remained alive increased the Soviet opportunity to use him as a symbol. In Atlanta, Abel lived in a different prison system, but a similar isolation. He was quiet, controlled, almost stubbornly opaque. American officials tried to question him, to turn him, to extract what he knew. He gave little. His value was not in what he would reveal. His value was in what his very existence represented to Moscow: a loyal officer captured on hostile ground. Here is the stake, restated without fanfare. A captured man had turned reconnaissance into propaganda, and now propaganda was turning into a negotiation neither side could publicly embrace. In late 1960, the advantage still leaned toward the Soviets in the court of opinion, but the Americans held one thing the Soviets could not manufacture: Abel's body, alive and retrievable. The problem was how to move from need to exchange without appearing to plead. Official channels were clogged. The United States and the Soviet Union had diplomats, but any overt trade would raise questions of precedent. Would trading encourage more captures, more kidnappings, more hostage diplomacy? Would it admit that espionage was normal rather than a moral crime? And beyond these abstract worries, there was the concrete fact that the Cold War was entering a new phase. By 1961, Eisenhower was leaving office. John F. Kennedy, the new American president, carried youth and uncertainty into a job that did not forgive either. Khrushchev watched him closely, probing for weakness. In August 1961, Berlin became the wound that never closed. The East German government, backed by the Soviets, erected the Berlin Wall, slicing streets and families and tram lines, making the division of Europe a physical fact. Berlin was now not just a symbol, but a trap, a place where missteps could become gunfire. That shift matters because it changed the environment of any potential exchange. Berlin was one of the few places where the two sides' worlds touched directly, where their soldiers could look at each other across a painted line, where a bridge could become a border. It was also where a separate human story entered the chain. Frederick Pryor, an American graduate student, was arrested by East German authorities while traveling in the divided city. His detention was not as globally visible as Powers, but it added a complication that would become leverage. Another captive, another government, another set of demands. The exchange now had more moving parts. The Soviets held Powers. The Americans held Abel. The East Germans held Pryor. And all of it took place inside an escalating contest over Berlin's status, where each side insisted the other's legitimacy was the real issue. This is where James Donovan re-enters, not as a defense attorney, but as a kind of unofficial diplomat. Donovan had defended Abel in court. That made him, in the eyes of Soviet intelligence, a known quantity. He was also, crucially, not a government official in the usual sense. That gave him plausible deniability. If talks failed, Washington could shrug. If talks succeeded, Washington could claim it had merely facilitated a humane exchange. In late 1961, Donovan was contacted, through intermediaries in the cautious, indirect style of espionage, about the possibility of a trade. The message was not romantic. It was practical. Moscow wanted Abel. Moscow might return Powers. Donovan's decision to engage was another hinge in the chain. He could refuse, protecting his reputation and his safety. He could accept, stepping into a world where failure might make him a scapegoat. He chose to proceed. Berlin in the winter of 1961 was a city of hard edges. The wall had been reinforced. Checkpoints became rituals of suspicion. West Berlin was an island of capitalist alignment surrounded by East Germany. The air tasted of coal smoke and anxiety. Every movement across the border was a negotiation with armed men. Donovan arrived as a private citizen carrying an extraordinary burden to speak for his country without officially speaking for it. He met with Soviet representatives, including Ivan Shishkin, a Soviet intermediary with ties to the security services, in rooms where the furniture seemed chosen to make conversation feel small. The talks were oblique, careful, full of phrases designed to allow retreat. The conflict was not only between nations, it was between institutions. The CIA wanted Powers back, but it did not want to admit the program too openly. The State Department wanted stability, but it feared setting a pattern. The Justice Department held Abel under a sentence handed down by a court. Releasing him would require legal steps and political cover. The White House wanted the problem solved, but it also wanted it solved without looking weak. Donovan's role was to make these competing pressures look, to the other side, like a single coherent offer. In East Berlin, another set of pressures existed. East Germany, under Walter Ulbricht's leadership and backed by the Stasi secret police, wanted recognition. It wanted to be treated not as a Soviet appendage, but as a state with agency. Holding an American student gave it a card to play, but it also risked provoking American anger. Donovan found himself dealing not only with Soviets, but with East Germans, often through Wolfgang Vogel, an East German attorney who served as a channel between the state's security apparatus and the outside world. The East Germans wanted Pryor to be part of the deal. For them, it was not merely about trading bodies, it was about forcing the United States to acknowledge their relevance. The negotiation became a three-body problem. Every move to satisfy one party disturbed another. At this point in the story, late 1961, early 1962, the balance is uncertain. The Soviets hold the famous pilot. The Americans hold the valuable illegal. The East Germans hold the student. Everyone has something to gain, and everyone fears that gaining it will look like surrender. The captured men are still doing what captured men do best in the Cold War, turning hidden operations into public leverage. Donovan traveled back and forth, carrying proposals, absorbing rebuffs, recalibrating. He argued to Washington that Abel was more useful alive than locked away, that trading him for powers would recover an American and remove a Soviet asset from U.S. soil. He argued to the Soviets that the Americans could deliver Abel, but would need to do it in a way that did not humiliate their own institutions. He argued to East Germans that releasing Pryor could be done without granting formal recognition, though the East Germans would try to extract symbolism regardless. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the machinery of the Cold War kept turning. Intelligence services watched Donovan, tracked his meetings, assessed his reliability. In Washington, officials debated whether Donovan was overstepping, whether he was being manipulated, whether he was the only channel that could work. The calendar tightened. The longer Powers remained in a Soviet prison, the more his captivity became a stain on American credibility. The longer Abel remained in Atlanta, the more he became, in Moscow, an unresolved injury. Both sides had reasons to accelerate and reasons to delay. In Atlanta, Abel was brought into conversations about his own fate. He was calm, almost detached. He asked for certain personal items. He wanted assurances about his wife, though in truth his family life was a constructed cover. He was not sentimental in public, but even a disciplined operative could understand that he was being moved from punishment to utility. In Vladimir, Powers waited under conditions designed to remind him he was powerless. He exercised. He read what he could. He measured time in small increments. His value to his captors depended on his survival, and that reality offered a thin kind of protection. There is a cruelty to that kind of protection. A man remains alive not because mercy has triumphed, but because he is still useful. Early 1962 brought the negotiation into sharper focus. Donovan returned to Berlin with messages and expectations. The Soviets signaled readiness to move if Abel could be delivered. The Americans signaled that the legal steps could be arranged. The East Germans signaled that Pryor's release would require attention. The pieces were lining up, but alignment is not agreement. Berlin's geography began to shape the plan. The city was divided but porous at certain points. One crossing, the Glienicke Bridge, connected West Berlin to Potsdam in East Germany. The bridge spanned the Havel River and sat in a quiet, almost picturesque area. Trees, water, winter fog. That quietness made it valuable. It could be sealed off and controlled. It could be turned into a corridor where two sides could meet without involving crowds. The bridge also carried symbolism. It was literally a link between worlds. And in the Cold War, symbols were not decoration. They were currency. The plan that emerged had a stark simplicity. On an agreed morning, Abel would be brought from American custody to West Berlin. Powers would be brought from Soviet custody to the bridge. At the center line, an invisible mark made real by armed men, they would be exchanged. But the simplicity masked a brittle dependency. Each side needed proof that the other would show up. Each needed confirmation that the right prisoner was present and alive. Each feared a last-minute reversal, a trick, a shot fired by someone who did not want peace. The East German complication required a parallel movement. Pryor would be released at Checkpoint Charlie, another crossing in Berlin that had already become famous as a point of confrontation. That release would happen in coordination, timed so that the Americans could claim a humanitarian success without openly bargaining with East Germany as a sovereign equal. As the day approached, the negotiation narrowed into logistics, routes, timing, signals, the choreography of vehicles moving through winter streets under watchful eyes. This is where constraints as antagonist becomes visible without needing to be named. Borders, checkpoints, legal paperwork, prison transfers, and the slow grind of bureaucracy, all pressing against a human moment that needed to happen at exactly the right minute. A recap, natural and necessary. By early February 1962, the United States and the Soviet Union are no longer arguing about whether spying happens. They are arguing about how to trade the evidence of it without losing face. The Soviets hold Powers, the Americans hold Abel, and both sides understand that the bridge in Berlin may be the only place where the story can be turned from propaganda back into control. In Washington, the final decisions were made with a lawyer's precision and a politician's fear. Abel's release required a legal mechanism. An exchange could be framed as a commutation, a deportation, a transfer under executive authority. Officials weighed the precedent. Would trading a spy for a spy encourage future captures? But the alternative, leaving Powers in Vladimir for years, carried its own cost, both human and strategic. The Kennedy administration, still learning the rhythms of Cold War crisis, wanted Powers home. It also wanted to avoid making him look like a pawn or making itself look like a bidder in a marketplace of hostages. Donovan's channel offered a way to manage that tension. He could be the face of the exchange without the exchange being, officially, a negotiation between equals. Abel was moved out of Atlanta. Powers was moved out of Vladimir. Each transfer was wrapped in secrecy, guarded by men trained to treat movement as vulnerability. On the Soviet side, Powers' presence was verified, his condition assessed. The Soviets had to ensure he was healthy enough to be returned without creating a new propaganda disaster. A sick or broken pilot might win sympathy for the Americans. The Soviets wanted the exchange to look like a transaction, not a rescue. On the American side, Abel was handled carefully. He was still a convicted spy. Guards watched him. Officials ensured he could not escape. But there was also a subtle change in atmosphere. He was no longer simply a prisoner. He was a negotiable asset. Donovan met Abel again, not in a courtroom, but in the context of departure. Donovan's relationship with Abel was unusual, lawyer and client, but also two men who had come to understand that they were, in different ways, professionals. Abel did not beg. He did not posture. He listened. He asked questions that revealed he understood the world he was re-entering. The night before the exchange, Berlin was cold and tense. Winter presses sound down into the ground. It makes a city feel closer to itself. The wall stood as a concrete fact. Searchlights swept. The air defense systems that had once failed to reach the U-2 now sat in the background like a reminder. Technology and politics could make borders lethal. The morning of February 10th, 1962, came before sunrise. Glienicke Bridge is not a grand structure in the way people imagine historic sites. It is functional, steel, roadway, railings. Its power comes from what it connects. On that morning, it was surrounded by security. West Berlin police and American personnel on one end, Soviet and East German forces on the other. The river below was dark. Fog drifted. The world felt muted, as if the city itself were holding its breath. Powers was brought to the bridge from the east. He was 32 now, but captivity had sharpened him, made him look older around the eyes. He walked with a cautious steadiness, aware that his body was being read as a message. He was escorted by Soviet officials, men whose faces did not reveal whether they considered him an enemy, an embarrassment, or simply paperwork. On the west side, Abel arrived under American escort. He wore a coat against the cold. His expression was controlled, almost mild, but that mildness had its own weight. He had spent years in American prison without breaking publicly. He walked now toward the line, returning to a system that would treat him as both loyal and compromised. The bridge's center point was marked not by a sign, but by posture, by the way each group stopped at a particular spot and held its position. In the Cold War, borders were often invisible until someone tried to cross them. A final verification occurred. The men were identified. There was no handshake. There was no ceremony. This was not reconciliation. It was an exchange of property that happened to be human. Then the movement began. Abel walked toward the east. Powers walked toward the west. Each step was both ordinary and loaded. The sound of shoes on the bridge was the sound of an era admitting, quietly, that it could trade rather than escalate. At nearly the same time, a separate scene unfolded at Checkpoint Charlie. Frederick Pryor, the American student who had become an East German bargaining chip, was released. His crossing was less photographed, less mythologized, but it mattered. It signaled that the exchange was not only between superpowers, it also involved the brittle politics of Berlin, where even students could become instruments. On the bridge, as Powers reached the western side, American officials took him in, bundled him, moved him quickly away from the open space. The first minutes of freedom are often not celebratory. They are procedural. Questions begin. Medical checks begin. The man becomes again a subject of his own system's needs. Abel, reaching the eastern side, was received by Soviet personnel and driven away. His return would be celebrated in a quiet, controlled manner. The Soviet Union did not often advertise the details of its illegals, but internally, retrieving Abel was a statement. Loyalty could be rewarded, and capture did not mean abandonment. The spine sentence resolves itself here in motion. A captured man turned reconnaissance into propaganda, and propaganda into a crisis. And at last the crisis into a negotiation conducted in the only language both sides could openly accept, the language of trade. The human cost, however, does not vanish when the bridge empties. Powers returned to the United States and entered another kind of trial, not a courtroom, but an investigation. The CIA debriefed him. Questions were asked about why he had not used the poison pin, why he had not destroyed the aircraft fully, what he had told the Soviets. Some Americans, trained to see captivity as moral failure, wondered aloud whether he had cooperated too much. The same country that had sent him into the Soviet sky now examined him as if he were suspect. That scrutiny was a quieter kind of punishment. It reflects something hard about Cold War societies on both sides. They demanded sacrifice, but they were uneasy with survivors, because survivors complicate the clean story of heroism. Powers' later life would carry that burden. He would fly again, not for the CIA, but as a civilian pilot, and he would die years later in a helicopter crash. His name would remain tethered to the day his aircraft fell and to the question of what a man owes when his country's secret mission becomes public. Donovan's life also changed. For a brief period, he was treated as a kind of national problem solver, a man who could navigate hostile systems with calm persistence. He would later be involved in other negotiations, including the exchange of prisoners after the Bay of Pigs. But the bridge exchange remained his signature act, one of those rare moments when a private citizen, operating in the seams of government, reshaped a public outcome. Abel returned to the Soviet Union and lived quietly, teaching and advising, a professional intelligence officer brought home, and then largely hidden. His value had been as much symbolic as operational. In a system that prized secrecy, even a recovered asset could be kept at a distance from the spotlight. And beyond these individuals, the larger world kept moving toward larger crises. The U-2 incident had helped freeze the thaw Khrushchev had flirted with in Paris. It sharpened mistrust. It reinforced the Soviet narrative that American talk of peace could coexist with intrusion. It reinforced the American narrative that Soviet secrecy made verification impossible. In 1962, the year of the exchange, the world would also face the Cuban Missile Crisis, the most dangerous confrontation of the Cold War, an event shaped in part by the same underlying problem the U-2 had been meant to solve: how to see the other side's intentions before fear filled in the gaps. That is why the story still matters. It is not only a tale of espionage craft and courtroom drama. It is a demonstration of how modern power works when it is terrified. Technology extends reach. Secrecy multiplies uncertainty. Leaders make decisions to reduce panic, and those decisions create new risks when exposed. The U-2 shootdown and the Glienicke Bridge swap show the Cold War as a chain of decisions that no one fully controls once it begins. A president authorizes a flight to prevent miscalculation. A missile crew fires to defend sovereignty. A pilot chooses survival. A government lies to protect a program. A rival leader waits to reveal the truth at maximum advantage. A summit collapses. A prisoner is sentenced but kept alive. Another prisoner, captured years earlier, becomes valuable because someone insisted the law mattered even for an enemy. An unofficial negotiator walks into Berlin's divided cold and tries to assemble a deal out of pride, fear, and human bodies. In the end, two men cross a bridge at dawn, and for a moment the machinery pauses long enough to let them pass. It is a small mercy made possible not by trust, but by shared self-interest, and by the recognition that even in a world built to hide, there are times when the only way forward is to trade the truth back into silence.